I am, of course, now joined on stage by the Honourable Anthony Albanese, MP, Leader of the Opposition. Welcome, Anthony.
Good to be here.
Great to have you here for State of the Nation.
It's looking a little bit different from usual, the National Press Club.
It is a little bit different to usual. Normally, of course, we would have a packed house. We'd be at Parliament House. This time we're doing it virtually, so whilst you can't see them, there are around 2,500 CEDA members and other audience members participating via the live stream. So,
Hi.
So a very popular format it's proven to be for us. But thank you so much for joining us today. We might start off giving the opportunity just to make a few comments of how you're seeing things, how you're seeing recovery, and then you and I can have a chat and we'll take some questions from our live stream viewers, if that's all right.
Sure. We've obviously been through a difficult period, but my starting point is where this difficult period began, which is that all of the economic indicators were either bad or certainly not good. So we had a number of interest rate decreases last year, and reductions in the economic growth forecasts as well. So the Reserve Bank was really belling the cat, saying that there was a problem with growth in the economy. We had low consumer demand, we had the worst retail trade figures for decades. We had productivity actually going backwards 2 quarters in a row, and we had business investment in decline. And I think the government had been complacent essentially since the May election. There was, from my perspective, a bit of a victory lap going on, rather than there being actual a plan, a strategy. So we were calling for things like an infrastructure bring forward. We were calling for increased policy that would drive business investment. We were calling for an energy policy which would drive that certainty that was required. And then, of course, we got hit by the drought had been prolonged, and then the bushfires came, and then the pandemic. So I think we start from a position that is much weaker than if we had taken some action last year. So, I mean, today again, the number of times I've heard a bring forward of the inland rail line over the last 7 years. I first heard it immediately after the 2013 election that was announced, but it hasn't actually led to anything happening on the ground. And so a starting point is how do we actually move out of the pandemic stronger? How do we not just return also to what was there beforehand? How can we actually learn the lessons that have been brought, whether that be our dependence upon particular markets? How can we have advanced manufacturing so that we're more resilient as an economy to the potential future shocks which are there? How can we take the listening to science on the pandemic and translate that logic, which is quite right, into listening to the science on issues like climate change?
Maybe where we'll start, I mean, I think one of the things we've sort of been grappling with too is we got to a certain point before COVID hit, and actually before the bushfires. We had the bushfires and then COVID, and I think a lot of people are grappling with, what do we learn from this? How do we think about where we were? And are we talking about the same agenda issues, or is this time to just actually get the blank sheet of paper out and start talking about a whole new sort of reform agenda?
Well, I think very much the latter. Part of my critique of the current government, which is in its third term, been there for 7 years, is how many times they talk as if they had just been elected. What's the reform strategy? We haven't seen any particular big reforms. Earlier this year, before the pandemic hit, the government was struggling to actually keep Parliament sitting, and indeed the Senate stopped sitting on one occasion because they just ran out of business. That, to me, the idea that the reform agenda has done, if you don't actually deal with an ongoing reform agenda, then the world will just move past us. And there's enormous opportunities in the Asian century. We're located in the fastest growing region of the world in human history. So how do we examine questions like security at work has been something that has been brought to the forefront. Who were the people who missed out during the pandemic, who were most vulnerable? They were those who weren't in secure work, casual employees, contract workers, who many of whom weren't eligible for any support at all. The people who didn't have sick leave, the people who don't have annual leave. Those issues about security. The other issues is the future of work. How do we identify what the future labour market will look like and make people secure in that? We've seen a massive growth, for example, in the gig economy without a consequential debate about what the implications are for security at work during that period. In particular, women, in terms of in the workforce, have particularly suffered. There's some talk about the pink recession has occurred. The impact, I believe, of the childcare changes that have been announced by the government will be negative there. I've said it's a reverse Titanic. It's women and children off JobKeeper first and off support. How do we recognise what essential work is as well? I think this period has been a chance for us to reset perhaps many of the things that people take for granted. Cleaners, often taken for granted. They've kept the show going. It's cleaners, supermarket workers, public transport workers, as well as nurses and many of the professions, teachers, early childhood educators that have kept the economy going. How do we deal with issues like affordable housing for essential workers as one of the missing elements that isn't there in the government's so-called home builder package that will do nothing for the most vulnerable people in the community, because there's nothing there for social housing, there's nothing there for affordable housing for essential workers. It would have been very easy to achieve. So how do we look at those equity questions as well? I think is one of the things that it's terrific that people come out and clap these essential workers and they appreciate the support they've had while the crisis has been on. How do we make sure that they're not forgotten during this period as well?
So maybe we can use the sort of social housing issue as a way for you to sort of talk about what you think the real priorities are here in terms of how we deal with these issues differently. I know you've spoken before about possibly being able to use superannuation funds to get greater investment in social housing. Maybe you might want to just take the audience through what you think the priorities are, how you think reform is capable of being delivered, and what you'd like to see.
Well, the first thing to say is to defend social housing, whether it be public housing or community housing, which can often be more innovative. I grew up in a two-person household, myself and my mum, in what was a council house in Camperdown that got transferred over to the New South Wales State Department of Housing at one stage when I was young. My mum was an invalid pensioner, couldn't work, crippled up with rheumatoid arthritis. The security that having a house, a roof over our head provided was really important in my journey to be able to sit here on the stage with you as the alternative Prime Minister. And to me, what we should be about, there's a lot of talk about aspiration. I see myself as an embodiment of aspiration. A mum who had very little formal education herself, really encouraged me to go through the school system, and I was the first kid in my family to finish school, let alone go to university. And that's about maximising the potential of individuals, but it's also about maximising the contribution to the whole national economy as well. Investment in education isn't just about an individual. There's a collective social benefit as well. And social housing, it seems to me that every galah in the pet shop can make money in Australia from social housing, but from investment in housing. But if you want to build a house in New South Wales, you've got to flog one off in the Rocks or Millers Point, where we can't have poor people mixing with wealthier people who can afford harbour views. Seems to me, I used to drive across, used to take, as a minister, you get to escort various international visitors around. And every time I drove over the Harbour Bridge to show someone around, I always pointed towards the Sirius building at the Rocks and said, this is a great country. That's public housing, purpose-built for older people and people with disabilities. It shows that we're a fair country. That's gone now. And it seems to me that the other opportunity that's there from investment in social housing is that you can actually have built in a skills package. You can do apprenticeships, you can do all that. You can't do any of that with the package that has been announced by the government, which will essentially mean that people who are going to rebuild anyway will be able to do it with some subsidy. There's a real question mark over any additional housing, whereas the social housing units that we did, for example, with the GFC, we did 20,000 or 21,000 new units and 80,000 renovations, refurbishments. The other possibility there is affordable housing for essential workers, where a number of superannuation funds are participating now in providing affordable housing investment for our police, our nurses, emergency service workers, people who can't afford to live close to where they work. And it really hit home with me just a couple of weeks ago, where the local police area commander of the police force asked me to do a video with him at Hanson Park in my electorate, because they can't get people to apply to work in the inner west. And it's because they can't afford to rent there, police officers. Now, it seems to me that there's a lost opportunity and a real natural fit as well between superannuation funds, which by definition want that long-term return. They also want security of investment, and nothing's more secure than bricks and mortar, as they say. A real opportunity to put that together, and with a bit of leadership, that can happen, and can happen quite effectively, in my view. Good for jobs, good for supply side in terms of housing, good social outcomes. It sort of ticks all the boxes, and I can't understand, except for ideology, what's got in the way of any investment at all in this housing package, except for privately owned investment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important issue in terms of looking at. I know the Productivity Commission, report of a few years ago highlighted the shortage in public housing. And I think it has become an issue. We've seen it brought to the fore a bit through this crisis, with the focus on homelessness and making sure we get, people off the streets. And I think it's been one of the fascinating sort of developments, if you like, that it is one of the areas you can point to and say, wow, when you've got to make decisions quickly, you can make things happen. And
you need to do it. And the same thing happened, of course, during the Sydney Olympics. There was a whole range of things happen. Why is it that we need a major event, either a good one or a negative one, in order to drive things that should happen? And the fact that we had homeless people put up in 4-star hotels in some cases because there was nowhere else for them to go. And similarly, in terms of emergency housing, there were women and kids escaping domestic violence were put up in Crown Towers in Melbourne. because of a lack of anywhere else for them to go. Now, it's a good thing that that sort of match happened of a need for somewhere to go with vacancies which are there. But we're a wealthy enough country, in my view, to do much better. And the other thing is that it's if we take a long-term view of investment, there are costs to homelessness for the state, if you like, as in big S state, of health costs. There's costs in terms of the justice system. There's a whole range of consequences behind homelessness, just like there are consequences behind poverty. And we need to value our greatest asset, which is our people, and how we maximise them. And we shouldn't always need an economic indicator to justify social action. But in this case, all the economic indicators show that if you actually invest, you will get a positive economic return, not just a social return.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to see the anecdotal evidence that's come out, which has sort of backed some of the research I think that University of Queensland did about 3 or 4 years ago, showing that if you put homeless people into stable housing, and I mean for the rest of us, we've all enjoyed really our homes, I think. I mean, not everyone. I know it can be challenging for some people, and you mentioned the challenges of domestic violence, but certainly my employees have, by and large, their home has been...
The homes have been a fortress during this period.
But we've seen I think some of this great evidence coming out where it's made it very obvious that if you're homeless and you're not having your health needs met in a consistent and stable way, you're going into the emergency facility, emergency rooms, you're getting the sort of care that's more expensive. You're not getting on top of mental health issues, and it's actually costing the system quite a bit. And so one of the things that's come out is actually the transparency around that. So if you look at a longer term perspective, you see the total cost of homelessness, not just the housing aspect itself. But let me take that thread and go back to this theme of essential services. It's something that we will be talking about through the State of the Nation conference. I was talking to one CEO who leads an essential service, and he said it's interesting how all of a sudden we talk about these services with pride again. And particularly after the bushfires and now this crisis, that all of a sudden, these essential services that it's sort of, to some people, kind of lost a bit of their shine, if you like, are now front and centre again. But there's some real challenges. I mean, we've seen great dynamism, we've seen great agility and innovation through the crisis, but we know that costs are going up. We know that demand for a lot of essential services is going up. The Productivity Commission, in its Shifting the Dial report of a few years back, really focused on human services and essential services and the need for an opportunity to improve productivity. How do you see that agenda from your perspective? And you've talked about being some of the lower wage workers. I think there's a message in there about wanting to improve their quality of life and wages. You've talked about productivity more broadly, but we really need to drive productivity through some of those areas. What's on your mind there?
Look, we do, and we can, and I spoke about this in the second vision statement that I did in Brisbane at the end of last year about the economy, which is that at the moment, if you have a system whereby wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living, there's been that wage stagnation for a period of time identified by the Reserve Bank, and that particularly has impacted on lower wage workers. And if you have productivity going backwards, then it seems to me the system isn't working for either employers or employees. So we need to get much better outcomes that drive that change through. There are ways that you can do it. In government, one of the things that we did was we took action on community services in terms of the awards system. And we legislated, and that made a substantial difference to people who were out there working on the front line of community organisations. I do think there's an opportunity now, because of the debate and the way that it's played out, that we shouldn't lose. And I know that that's the view of Sally McManus and the ACTU. I know it's also the view of many in the business community. I've had this discussion with Jennifer Westacott and been having round tables with the BCA and ACCI and AIG as well. So it seems to me there is this opportunity at the moment to seize so that we can have a win-win going forward.
Nice segue to the first question I've got off my my live stream feed, if you like. I've got a question from Brian Doricott, and I think it's picking up on some of the themes that were raised with the Prime Minister earlier, some of the comments you just made there about working together, I guess. Now, I know the opposition has played an important role through this crisis as well in supporting the stimulus measures, supporting job seeker, etc. I'm interested, firstly, in maybe some reflections on how you've tackled leadership through this crisis. But then, as we look forward to the months ahead, what you see your role as in terms of this issue of trying to get things done, but also, of course, wanting to challenge on the things that you think are important.
Well, when I became leader of the Labor Party on the first day, that just over a little over a year ago, I said that I wanted to be known as the Labor leader, not the opposition leader. It's an important distinction, I think. I look at the way that the then coalition opposition behaved during the global financial crisis, voted against the stimulus package 30 times. We sat till 3 a.m. in the morning, and it was very negative. And that was the package that had the big infrastructure investment in it as well. And they wrote off, said it was inevitable we'd go into recession, and Joe Hockey, as the shadow treasurer, that was the position that was put forward. We've behaved very differently. We have said that we won't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we announced very early that we would support the packages, and we indeed vote for all 3 of the packages, whilst pointing out the weaknesses that we thought were there. So in the first package with JobSeeker, we were calling for a wage subsidy early on. And had the wage subsidy been put in place, JobKeeper, at the time that JobSeeker was put in place, you would not have seen those massive queues on the Monday morning. It would have been a different dynamic would have occurred, because that was almost saying to employers, it's okay if you need to put people off because they're going to get $1,500 rather than $750. It was a signal, and it was only then the government acted due to the pressure of unions and business and ourselves. JobKeeper, we thought there were gaps, and there are for casual employees, for a range of workers in particular industries as well, due to the nature of it. Chances are the people recording and on the cameras at this event are not employed by the National Press Club for more than 12 months as their job. So whole sections of the arts and entertainment sector have just missed out, and we have pointed that out as well. We have pointed to as well the fact that for some people have got many times more their existing or previous wage. You have, if you're a casual employee for more than 12 months working at the local hardware store, which has seen probably not hardware because they haven't got a downturn, but working at the local cafe, then you're eligible. But if many other people working for 11 months and 2 weeks aren't. So we pointed out the inadequacies which are there. We pointed out that superannuation, as did the industry, the super changes would see fraudulent activity, and indeed it has. And we pointed out that people withdrawing their funds was not a rational long-term economic decision that will not just hurt the retirement savings of people, of individuals who take that money out, that will also reduce the national savings pool and will also distort the decisions made by superannuation funds. Because if you have an intervention that allows people to withdraw those funds, you're more likely to distort the market in which the investment takes place and to head towards investment in equities rather than long-term long-term infrastructure investment like housing that produce that long-term return. So we think there have been a range of policy errors that we've pointed out, but we haven't allowed that to be we haven't played a negative role. I think we've been constructive. And our role is to continue to be constructive, to continue to point towards the sort of investments and when the government has got it right. For example, local government investment, things like roads to recovery are an obvious way to get quick money out the door. We've been calling for the investment in small and medium projects that were ready to go for a long period of time. We've pointed out that the government's investment strategy, I don't know why they just say $100 billion over 10 years. I don't know why they don't say $1 trillion over 50 years. Like, it's just a nonsense. So you've got areas like the Princes Highway that a big figure, but $50 million. The rest is off on the Never Never, a road that was critical to people getting out of communities during the bushfires. You've got a range of projects here. You've got the Barton Highway here to Yass that's used by 3,500 people every day commuting to Canberra. But the investment, they've been there for 7 years. You've got to dig a hole eventually. You can't just put out press releases. But a lot of the investment is really off on the Never Never when much of that investment should be ready to go. I mean, the so-called bring forward, for example, Western Sydney Rail through Badgerys Creek Airport that was re-announced again today by the Prime Minister, the end date for half the project, they're still not going down to Macarthur in southwest Sydney, is the day that the airport opens. It's still 2026. There's no bring forward. That's obvious that you need transport there the day that the airport opens. So I think that in terms of the opportunities which are there, we'll continue to be constructive. We'll continue to put forward ideas, including the opportunities that are there on energy policy for clean energy, which go to the first vision statement I did with CEDA in Perth last year of jobs in the future of work. There's all those opportunities. Why is it that Australia produces everything that goes into a battery and everything that goes into a solar panel, but we aren't making them here? And the opportunity with mechanisation isn't that jobs get lost. It's actually that domestic jobs can be created because labour is far less a proportion of the costs of production. And therefore, the cost differential of labour between Australian labour costs and developing countries or China or countries to our north is far less important. And that provides an incredible opportunity. Copper that we mine here, copper is an important component in electric vehicles. We should be doing more in terms of taking advantage of our natural assets to build on them and to create jobs and economic activity here.
I was going to bring you back to your CEDA speech in Perth, where you did talk about all these really important issues around innovation and essentially, productivity and new industries for the future. And I think sitting beneath that, and this goes to one of the questions that someone's asked through the live stream, sitting beneath that is the role of science. and research, essentially. You talked about science and evidence in your opening remarks. So, where do you see science policy? I mean, what's your thinking there? And if I can ask perhaps maybe a more challenging question, a question I'd love the answer to, is how do you connect those opportunities to the community in a way that they think broadly that it's going to benefit them?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, on the first point, I'll be do a little ad here. Speaking at the National Press Club next Wednesday, doing my next vision statement is on science and innovation. And the reason why I'm doing that is the first major speech coming out of the pandemic crisis is that I see that as being absolutely key to both innovate and encourage that innovation that we've been historically very good at, whether it's medical breakthroughs or Wi-Fi or solar research at ANU, UNSW, whether it be so many things down to, dare I say it, screw tops for wine bottles, a very important breakthrough. All of these things Australia has been good at. What we haven't always done is commercialise, take advantage of that. So it's a matter of doing both. The CSIRO should not be struggling for funding. It shouldn't be begging. It should be, an incredible national asset. If only it as an institution was regarded as important as the AFL or the NRL, we'd be, as a society, I think, much better off. So it's a matter of valuing that as well. And I think the pandemic is an opportunity for that. The work that's being done with CSL and in Queensland in terms of looking for a vaccine with CSIRO, all of that research reminds us of the importance of science in terms of medicine, but it's so more important than just that as well. And my statement next week will go to that. And the second part was...
Well, it's just this question around, I have to say, you've talked about, I thought you were pretty brave in going out and starting to talk straight up about productivity and innovation, because in all honesty, they're two issues that we've really struggled to capture the public's imagination with, in the sense that there's been broad support for these issues and agendas and bold policy reform in a way that would underpin productivity. And it goes to the point that, and therefore prosperity and higher wages and all the rest of it. But anyone who's been in the policy space for long enough knows that productivity is a bad word. Like, broadly, the community doesn't like it. And innovation is a word that most in the community kind of look at and go, well, what does that mean? It's a bit of a tosser word, like, oh, yeah, that's great for you. And I agree with you, actually. I think there's a moment in time where we can maybe reframe that, because, if I look at the interest that some of our members have had in the podcasts that we've done with the likes of Peter Doherty and Larry Marshall from the CSIRO, and there's a real pride in Australia's role in looking to respond to the COVID, develop the vaccine. So I think there's a point in time where you can shift the imagination, but we haven't managed to do it so far.
I think that's right. Well, the problem is when people hear productivity, sometimes when someone says it, what they hear is, you want me to work harder. And when they hear innovation, they hear my job's disappearing. So we need to talk about, and some of that, frankly, is driven by politics. I mean, trying not to be partisan here, but the sections of the sort of climate deniers in the coalition who are the handbrake on anything happening, talking about renewables as somehow meaning less jobs. Whereas, of course, renewables, if you look at what's happening in Whyalla, if you look at the potential there, that's, the aluminium refinery in Gladstone is looking at increasing its production massively by using solar energy. That they see as being the key to that. So it's a matter of having the argument It's the first thing that you've got to do, not shy away from it. And going and looking at, in Perth, there's a major gas operations is the company that has the display section looking at hydrogen powering homes and what it looks like there, as well as, of course, using that to power their existing buildings and structure. There's a range of ways in which the truth is that innovation and productivity is what has liberated our quality of life. Now, there are downsides in that, but overall, the quality of life of Australians is much better than it was some time ago. Often, to give some balance in here, often the people on the progressive side of politics can completely romanticise the past as well, and that can be a bit of a handbrake on change. But I am someone who is optimistic, someone who does embrace change, someone who wants, though, to take people on that journey. And that's a matter of leadership as well, from the top, but engagement as well, and trying to... People are understandably fearful of change. It's got to be explained how that will benefit people, rather than some obscure statement about, productivity going forward and figures. I wouldn't be distributing Productivity Commission reports to around in tabloid form. You've got to get it down to an area whereby people can get it. And people, if it's explained properly, people vote with their feet. Any time a public transport project has been built in this country, the patronage has exceeded the forecasts. Regional Rail Link in Victoria, any of recently the Northwest Metro, the Gold Coast Light Rail that was criticised and opposed before it was built, Redcliffe Rail Link, Noongar to Seaford in Adelaide, the Perth expansions of the rail network, people respond positively because they can see it and touch it and participate in it. So we need, I think, to get much better, but we shouldn't shy, and it's all of our responsibility. That's productivity. It's much more productive than sitting in your car on a toll road. And that's the sort of change that we need, cultural change, that I think you can bring people on.
Yeah, I think it is a bit of capturing the imagination and reminding people of the benefits. I think it will be a struggle. I mean, we've known through our own survey work that when you ask people what matters most to them, that innovation and business investment and skills and things that go with it, much less investment in science, sort of lurks down the lower end of the priority list. But I take heart from having listened to Megan Clark talk about the Space Agency and how much that seems to be really exciting younger people about science and the realm of the possible, if you like. So
you look at what's happening in Murchison in WA, with perhaps the world's most powerful telescope that's looking at the origins of it all. Incredible scientific breakthrough, because it's a fair way away from any population centre. It's hard for people to just drop in. But you look at the pride that Australians still have about parks and the role that we played in the first moon landing. We still talk about it. Pretty good movie, but we still talk about it as well. It is a source of pride, and we need to harness that. there is cynicism out there. I mean, high-speed rail, it stacks up. And people go, oh no, we don't have a population. When actually, if people take a step back and think about it, Sydney to Melbourne, always in the top 4 air routes in the world, at one stage first in the world, heavy population, the regional economic development potential along that route as well as up to Brisbane, it absolutely stacks up. This is Australia's largest inland city we're in right now. If this city was under an hour from the CBD of Sydney, it transforms. I live in Marrickville. You should be able to, if you're a good golfer, you could hit a golf ball and hit the city. I have to allow 50 minutes minimum to get into the city by road. I usually catch the train, but if you're an hour from the CBD, living in, it's a great city to live in. It's a livable city. The costs of housing are far less. You transform the economics of regional economic development, for not just for here, but the Southern Highlands, for Wagga, for Albury, Wodonga, for Shepparton. And yet, we can't get that momentum, which will take, I suspect, if nothing happens, then a Labor government will give it momentum.
Well, Anthony, I've got to draw an end to it there, but thank you so much for your time today. Ladies and gentlemen, can you join me in thanking Anthony Albanese? It's fantastic to hear the optimism. There's some big challenges ahead. You, as leader of the Labor Party, will have an important role to play in those. And we look forward to learning about your science initiatives next week, and we'll get you back on the CEDA stage to talk about that and a few other things in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.